Good morning, everyone. My name is Len Elmore, and I'm the co-chair of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. And on behalf of my fellow commissioners, we'd like to welcome our guests here in person, as well as those joining us virtually. This session is being recorded and will be posted along with other meetings materials on knightcommission.org tomorrow. Before we begin, a few housekeeping points. As previously stated, this session is being recorded, and recorded video and other meeting materials, as I said, going to be available on knightcommission.org. We've got a very large virtual audience. Commission members and our guests, make sure you use your microphones when speaking so that the virtual audience can hear you. Before we get started today, we want to thank the Knight Foundation for their support of our work in this meeting. And we are particularly pleased the Knight Foundation President and CEO, Maribel Perez Wadsworth, is with us today. Thank you, Maribel. I also want to formally recognize my co-chair, Pam Bernard, who could not be here with us today due to an illness, and we wish her a swift recovery. 3 of our other members are joining us virtually throughout the course of the day. Kim Ng, Commissioner of the Athletes Unlimited Softball League, Dr. Kim Harmon, head team physician from the University of Washington, and Jessica Mendoza might be joining us from Los Angeles, where she actually called the Dodgers-Phillies game last night. Well, we're very pleased. Okay. We are very pleased to start today's session with Senator Maria Cantwell, who just last week introduced the Student Athlete Fairness and Enforcement Act, otherwise called the SAFE Act, with Senator Cory Booker and Senator Richard Blumenthal. Senator Cantwell is the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee, which has significant involvement in any college sports legislation. So Senator Cantwell, thank you very much for your leadership. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you on the goals of the SAFE Act for college sports. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Again, thanks to the Knight Commission for inviting me this morning and for your particular focus in this area. And I've had a chance to say hello to some of you this morning, but for those of you who I haven't had a chance to talk to, we view this as a very big dialogue and discussion and appreciate your expertise. So if you can, stay in touch with us afterwards and help us, that would be great. I'm here this morning to obviously talk about the SAFE Act, but I come with a great sense of personal humor as I continued to serve on the Commerce Committee and watched my predecessors deal with college sports issues. Literally, when you think of the Commerce Committee, it's one of the largest jurisdictions of a committee in the United States. And when you look at the various oversight responsibilities on communication policy or aerospace policy or maritime policy or what have you, and then you say, well, what is the authority of the committee? Literally, there's just one word. It just says sports. That's it. And I said to myself, if I ever make it up to being the ranking member of the chair of the committee, I'm never going to focus as much as these men focus on sports. I'm never going. So as I find myself sitting here this morning, I realize that they focused on it for very good reasons, because there was a very large ecosystem and there were lots of policies that needed to be addressed by Congress. We participated in some of those. You may know that we passed, with the help of Senators Moran and Blumenthal, the Empowering Olympic, Paralympic, and Amateur Athletes Act of 2020. That was legislation to make sure that we had good representation on national governing bodies, particularly at the USOPC, and to address some of the issues that we were finding that were brought about by the U.S. Center for Safe Sports and ensure the U.S. Center for Safe Sports independence from the USOPC. We also passed legislation that was a Cantwell-Capito bill that was the equal pay for Team USA. That was important legislation that said if you are representing the United States of America at any kind of U.S. or global event, that the compensation in sports needed to be equal regardless of gender. And we really give the U.S. women Olympic soccer team great credit for trying to get that issue addressed, and then our legislation passing and becoming law too. So that's to say we haven't ignored sports issues, but clearly the changing environment has made addressing this issue critically important. I wanted to share a little bit about my own thoughts about this, particularly as this committee has had other responsibilities like the CHIPS and Science Act, a very important piece of legislation that we passed, which is about U.S. competitiveness. When you think about the way the United States of America shows our competitiveness, certainly GDP, certainly military, certainly great adventures like going to the moon, or winning at international Olympic events. Nothing probably says U.S. competitiveness as great as the story of the boys in the boat. The University of Washington going to the 1936 Olympics and persevering, even against all odds, to be successful at a moment in time when the United States of America wanted to show its strengths and moral compass. Now, as we see a changing landscape in the sports environment because of legal issues and court decisions, and certainly media and media consolidation issues, it's pretty important to me that we maintain a competitive ecosystem that is the strength across the United States of America. I know that college sports drives enrollment. I know it drives revenue, and that's an important thing. But we need, just as we needed with the CHIPS and Science Act, to have innovation happen all across the United States of America. If the United States is going to succeed in the information age, we need to spend money on engineering. We need to spend money on things that are going to grow the economies of the future. We don't have extra resources to spend somewhere else, and we certainly can't afford to tax tuition of students to pay for college sports. But we need the college sports ecosystem to be just as broad as the innovation system across the United States. Innovation can't just happen in Seattle and San Francisco and Boston, and neither can college sports be dominated by two big divisions and leave everybody else out of the equation. So as we look at trying to preserve this ecosystem and trying to solve the problems that we see, particularly as revenue challenges with NIL become everyday challenges, we looked at how do we protect the ecosystem of college Olympics and women athletes and small schools, and create a national goal to actually grow those opportunities, not shrink them. So that is how we got to the SAFE Act. And maybe let me just say a few words about the SAFE Act and its desires to keep that ecosystem. First, we believe that putting rules in place help us reduce liability. Other people may have other ideas about that, but when you have certainty and predictability in rules, we believe you'll reduce liability. So how did we do that? First, we basically are willing and did put a federal preemption on the table that gave athletes their rights. I want to thank the NCAA for several years of conversations with them. They tried to move forward on putting real scholarship and health standards on the table, but we are putting them into federal law and giving them a right and preempting other states, and we're very, very proud of that. Secondly, we're putting rules in place on transfer, which are two transfer opportunities. In reading of the legal cases in the legal analysis, our challenge is to create fair rules. I'm not saying there couldn't have been other rules, but I think this particular two-rule transfer to opportunities is something that would be looked on by the courts as a reasonable way of managing the system. And three, we codified many of the decisions that were part of the Grant House versus NCAA settlement agreement and put those into statute 2 to create more predictability. Second, though, we realized that the amount of NIL opportunity and the increasing opportunity for revenue meant that the best way to preserve the ecosystem was to look at the Sports Broadcasting Act and look at modifying that Broadcasting Act and giving the landscape the ability to pool media rights. This we thought was incredibly important to create a revenue stream as institutions were dealing with the NIL demands and creating an opportunity for us to work together collectively on those revenue opportunities to help smaller schools maintain the system. So that included making some statements about roster and scholarship levels as a goal to maintain those. We heard this from a lot of institutions across the United States, how important it was to, if we were going to amend the Sports Broadcasting Act and put more revenue into the picture, then we should also make sure that we are trying to set either 2023 or 2024 goals and trying to maintain getting the revenue out the door that particular way. The SCORE Act also, the SAFE Act also put a very bold statement in trying to deal with sports agents and trying to say that we really need to have a very aggressive FTC and AG process of going after bad actors who right now are really undermining the system throughout the United States of America. This particular issue is something we've heard about from coaches associations and people around the United States, that people are just presenting themselves as agents at the drop of a hat at sporting events, at high school venues, and then luring people into very deceptive practices. So we want and believe that we should be very aggressive on the authority that should be given to help police this issue. So our belief is that the construct of putting more revenue on the table and putting more rules on the table, but clearly stating what athletes' rights are the way to get legislation passed by Congress. While there are other pieces of legislation, and I'm sure you'll have questions about this, we believe that this is the best process to go forward. And I'm here to ask you today to help join in that effort of helping come to the table and bring the interested parties together to support these concepts. Rules that give you predictability and an amendment to the Sports Broadcasting Act that give us the revenue to preserve the ecosystem. So thank you all very much for allowing me to be here this morning.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. At this time, our commission would like to ask a few questions.
Good morning, Senator. My name is Bob Bowlesby. As a former college wrestler and one-time director of athletics at Stanford University, a school that sponsors 36 varsity sports, the most in the country. I applaud the SAFE Act's stated intentions to bolster Olympic sports and women's sports and require institutions to maintain the 23-24 standards in those two areas, scholarship levels and roster sizes. Could you expand a little more on the details of how the SAFE Act incentivizes institutions to maintain both the quantity and the quality of their Olympic sports and women's sports? Because there's obviously a lot of different ways to spend money once you get on a university campus, and how the act might support those initiatives I think would be interesting to all of us.
Well, to receive the revenue, schools have to preserve the scholarship roster for Olympics and women's sports at those 23, 24 levels, and to make sure that we are preserving that system. The goal is to ensure that as revenue grows, that those sports investments are continued to be made. We look at other revenue sources that we think might be helpful. We threw a thing in there about patches that schools could pursue, similar things that have been pursued in the NFL, and we certainly put an idea on the table that streaming media rights should be kind of used or lose, is what we're saying. Right now, in a lot of the media negotiations, broadcast and streaming rights go together, and while someone could make a case that that's something you want to do for the revenue sports, I would argue, I would say that there's a case to be made that maybe you should still even there look at different ways of doing things. But for the non-revenue sports, you should let them use the world of narrowcasting, that now you can broadcast one-to-one to people who are very interested in those sporting events, the ability to have their own streaming media rights. So we think this is a tool. Do we think there's tons of money here? No, but we think there could be millions of dollars, a few $1 million here for each of these sports. And that kind of revenue opportunity would be very beneficial for what I would say a bootstrap model, where now, as we've seen women's basketball continue to grow, how do we know that there aren't some other sports that might grow if they had their own revenue through streaming media that might be able to attract, a huge base of alumni, or a US audience, or even a global audience? Again, we're very proud of the pole vaulters at the University of Washington. I think we're at like 4th in the world in a record, but try to find or follow them. Hard to do right now. But why aren't we taking some of these events that now could receive even international notoriety and allowing universities to make revenue off of them?
Thank you.
Senator Cantwell, to follow up, Beth Brook, and to follow up Bob's question, and thank you for illustrating a little more of your thinking into the expansion of the Sports Broadcasting Act, and also just acknowledging the need for additional revenue in the system for the collegiate Olympic sports and the women's sports. It's an enormous recognition in the SAFE Act, so thank you for that. In our public opinion poll and in our D1 Leaders Survey poll, one thing that we found a lot of support for is federal funding for the collegiate Olympic sports and women's sports. Did you give any consideration in the SAFE Act to new sources of federal funding?
We did. I mean, we thought about it. In general, you should think of the SAFE Act as we tried to listen to where we thought there was the most consensus and put that into legislation and get it out there so that we could coalesce more thought and creativity on perfecting this issue. So I really do feel it's time for people to now come to the table and figure out how to solve this problem. On the revenue side, we've always been concerned about Olympic sports. The AP has done a good job documenting a case we had in our state of a snowboarder who basically grew up in our area and ended up snowboarding for the Russians instead of the United States and winning medals. And that always stuck in my craw as, why is this happening to us? And if we're not putting enough money into, the Olympics, why aren't we figuring out what we can do to be more supportive? So we've talked to them about the same streaming rights issue, and thought about that, and thought about even, going further than what we've done in the SAFE Act. But at the same time, we thought the most important thing to do to keeping the Olympic ecosystem, which is the NCAA system, is to support that in the right way and not let revenue basically just become, the priority of just the largest institutions. And we found that even the largest institutions who are, doing 20 or 20 plus sports are challenged to compete against schools that have less competitive, broad sports investments, and yet they're both competing on a football landscape. So what's getting shortchanged? The Olympic investment or the broad scholarship investment. So we thought, well, let's get that right first, and then let's see what others think, what appetite there is for maybe addressing this further. We didn't find a lot of people coming to us, and again, we find that the entire landscape here is diverse. And how do you build consensus? You guys probably feel that as the Knight Commission yourselves. How do you build consensus? Well, that's our challenge here. So we think SAFE represents the most consensus building, but it doesn't mean we couldn't put more ideas on the table as we build that consensus. And for me, I just think, again, I think the challenge is the revenue, the digital landscape. If you look at what happened with the last media deal for the Olympics, and what did that deliver for the system? There's a lot of disruption. There's a lot of change. What can you do to say that the United States of America prioritizes Olympic scholarship, and it is our system that trains for the Olympics? I think it's like 75% of Olympic athletes come through our NCAA system. So what are we doing to preserve that?
Senator, we really appreciate you being here. My question comes partly from being a former president at Florida State University and Penn State University. Your bill does not have an antitrust exemption or a prohibition about students becoming employees, but a lot of institutional leaders in the NCAA think that both of those things are very important for us to continue to preserve college sports. I think partly this is because we expect just continued litigation and continued sort of chaos and disruption that you prefer to. So can you give us some sense of why it is that those two things were not something that were in your bill?
Well, we looked at what the settlement agreement looked like. If you think about the landscape in front of you, it's the Grant House versus NCAA settlement. I mean, that is the biggest read of the legal landscape. And as you see there, that issue was not addressed. And so we did not think it was fertile ground for being addressed further. When you look at the huge amount of revenue that is involved here, billions of dollars, and what those legal challenges have been in the past, it didn't, to us, look like that was a way to create predictability. That wasn't going to get us, with the amount of opposition, wasn't going to get us a system. So we looked at what rules could we put in place instead? What rules could we put in place that would limit that liability? And I think that's still, while we, on eligibility, haven't quite found the right consensus yet, but we're working on it still. We think that there are a few more things that you could put on the table that would create even more stability to the process. And so that's why we chose that route.
Thank you.
Senator Cantwell, I echo my fellow commissioners. Thank you for joining us today. Some of the opponents of the SCORE Act and the SAFE Act do not want to codify limits on athlete compensation when there are no limits on coaching compensation. How would you respond to concerns about limiting athlete compensation when coaches and staff members would not face similar limits?
Well, I'm happy to hear the community's thoughts on coaching limitations. I'm all for it. I think as we look at this, we definitely want to make sure that athletes have all the NIL rights they deserve. And so there is no limitation there. But the Grant House versus NCAA settlement agreement came up with the regime as it related to what they thought should be a cap to not create an arms race similar to, I'm assuming similarly believed to what the the NBA and NFL were doing as a percentage. And so that, again, we'd have to go back to the NCAA and the participants in that litigation to figure out why everybody put that particular revenue as part of the equation. We don't, so we just kept that philosophy, but we think that the rights under the SAFE Act do give students, athletes, the right to an unlimited amount of NIL revenue. And we thought that was the most important thing. It's important to know that in the SCORE Act, those rights are abrogated after 10 years. After 10 years of the settlement, there are no longer NIL rights. So we think that is a very different contrast to what we're guaranteeing in the law.
Thanks, Lynn. Senator Cantwell, it's great to have you here. My name is Kendall Spencer. I was a track and field national champion at the University of New Mexico. Under the SAFE Act, the new proposed committee organized to determine shared revenue distribution provides for about 14% athlete representation. However, it doesn't appear there are any modifications for athlete roles and representation on a broader level. So my question is, do you expect athletes to find representation through NCAA governance at a broader level through another vehicle, or is it your sense that the current athletes are content with the level of representation they currently experience?
Oh, I think we need more athlete representation for sure. We think that the SAFE Act is probably the biggest down payment on student athlete rights that's been proposed to date. But when we were trying to look at the revenue distribution and the revenue, how to get everybody to participate in media right discussions, and then how to allocate those resources out the door, we definitely were trying to think of the entire landscape. So I would say, yeah, we're open to suggestions on how to get more student athlete participation in the equation for sure. It's an important aspect of this discussion. Very important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I'm former president of Quinnipiac University, and before that, in the Power 2 in my previous life. So I'm especially appreciative of how you're advocating for some of the mid-majors and not just the very top of the distribution. I think you alluded to this, the Sports Broadcasting Act, and the need to revise it, 60 years old, to let some pooling occur in the negotiations. But at the moment, it only covers free over-the-air television, and yet we know that streaming and cable are really predominant forms of viewing. Do you see the SBA expanding to those other channels legally as much as policy-wise?
I think so again, probably a much bigger responsibility for the Commerce Committee than just the word sports in our little title is the entire issue of our oversight of the FCC and media issues. And we always think about competition. What are we doing to drive competition in media? And what are we doing to protect consumers? And you'll also see in the SAFE Act a provision that basically says that if the antitrust exemption goes forward, that you have to provide so much content that is not behind a paywall. And so what we're trying to do is to say that while we want to see as much competition and we would be open to considering how to do that, we don't want, as we see a much, much more consolidation of the media landscape, very vertical consolidation, what are we going to do to make sure that we are protecting, that there's a competitive environment, and that, again, that content isn't artificially more expensive than it needs to be for individuals. And so that's why we're saying, look at the streaming rights as well, see if you can separate those, make sure that the consumer isn't seeing. We had a hearing earlier this year about the various service providers that were putting a lot of content behind paywalls and then not being true about their advertising of what they were able to provide. And so it was very frustrating to the consumer. So we would consider this, but we want to make sure that, again, the issues are, how do we make sure that we think about the consumer? How do we drive competition and create an ecosystem that helps support all athletes?
Thank you.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for coming today. My name is Kevin Blue. You've mentioned a very welcome focus on growing revenue, especially for Olympics and women's sports. But I would like to ask if you've contemplated whether cost controls in college athletics for broader spending are also necessary. If you study the history of revenue growth in college sports, revenue has multiplied on an inflation-adjusted basis, but I think people generally agree that financial pressures today are as significant as they've ever been. And in fact, more student fees and institutional support are going to support even major college athletics. So what are your views on spending controls?
I think we have a big question today, given this media landscape and escalation with the proposed Big Ten proposal. Does this new commercial business arrangement still support the tax-exempt purposes of schools and universities and students? While that may seem not as directly to your answer, but we're here now saying we're going to allow institutions to do private equity deals. And I'm not even sure that meets the purpose of the tax-exempt status that universities have. Does it? And so that is like the example on the table right now that I think you all have to deal with. But yes, I think that when we think about this, to the goal that I mentioned earlier, and I look over to Kirk because he ran an institution that literally he came as a land grant institution. WSU is, important on the sports front, but when the Pac-12 blew a $35 million hole in his $85 million budget, and Kirk no longer gets to become the institution that is doing the most important wheat research in the United States of America, because we're now going to diminish it, you're going to get me pretty mad. And I'm going to start asking questions, because it's more important for the United States of America to keep our economic competitiveness. But if we're going to let the haves and have-nots exist in the United States of America instead, then yes, we have to start asking ourselves, what are we going to do about this? So I would say, let's get smart about putting rules in, limiting our liability. Let's figure out how to share the revenue across the entire ecosystem, because these institutions are important, and the national challenge is for us to be successful economically. And now, WSU has a very proud sports tradition and has produced some great athletes, and that's the whole thing. You just never know. You never know who, even this guy who's this scuba guy who's beating Seattle, like he went to Seattle U. He's a Detroit, Tigers guy, but he went to Seattle U. Like, not exactly the university that you would think of that's going to produce a guy that might be another Cy Young Award winner. How do you know where someone's going to come from? And so if institutions are going to, just continue to run roughshod over these larger objectives, then I would say, yes, what are we going to do to think about the cost side of the equation? So just because students deserve rights doesn't mean that, now all of a sudden, like, we're going to sell equity to, the market and maybe even jeopardize our tax exempt status. So these are the cost issues that I think we should deal with. Does that make sense? Is that what I'm saying? Okay, I see a lot of heads nodding. Okay. So I'm not saying you couldn't say, let's cap college coaches things or spending in general, but I think the key thing right now is you're going to let somebody take and monetize what is really a public resource and the rights of these students, and you're going to try to pass a bill in the House of Representatives to abrogate and cancel their rights, and then you're going to give an equity firm the ability to monetize that and go to the bank on it. That's a real problem.
Senator Cantwell, my name is Peter Roby. In a recent Division I leaders survey that we conducted with Elon University poll, 77% of Division I leaders said that limiting college athletes to 4 seasons of eligibility was important. This result comes amid the NCAA facing several lawsuits related to its 4 seasons of eligibility rule. Do you have thoughts about the current eligibility rules, and is there a reason the SAFE Act doesn't address this issue when it does address another eligibility hot topic on how often college athletes can transfer? And why doesn't it include rules on eligibility?
Good question. And I think we need to really focus on what does the academic year mean. I think the NCAA would even tell you that the academic year definition is causing a lot of consternation in how the courts are interpreting these issues. So we frankly just ran out of time to find. We didn't hear consensus. We didn't hear a solution. But we definitely want to engage and very open to putting something into federal law.
Okay, being respectful of your time, we recognize that we're close to the end. I just have one quick question, and that would be, this discussion is centered on a number of very important provisions in the SAFE Act. And I'm just curious if there was one must-have provision that you'd like to see, what would that be and why?
Well, I
didn't mean that.
That can be answered different ways. But if you said pull out a provision today and pass it, my guess is you could pull out the agent provision and get bipartisan support and pass it. You could pass that today. And, nobody should be opposed. No Democrat, no Republican, nobody should be opposed of reining in the bad behaviors of these individuals. Now, if you're saying I get to pick one thing overall, look, it's important to make sure that athletes' rights are represented, and it's important to not forget that the ecosystem is valued at a lot. So the question for us is not, is there revenue here? The question is, what's the fair distribution of that revenue? What is the fair distribution of that and the opportunities for both athletes and schools? And to me, that's the most pressing issue as it relates to preserving what's so unique about women and Olympic scholarships. So your president here, we had a conversation, her role with the News Media Alliance. We're having the same problem in local journalism. We're having a problem where the information age is eating the revenue stream, and now we have less and less local journalism. And we have to fight back. When you have competition in journalism, you have perfect information. It's an ecosystem. And so right now, don't blow this opportunity to preserve a really, 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 really great ecosystem. It is not called just the Big Ten and the SEC. It is not. That is not the name of this ecosystem. And our job, even though we're challenged by the information age and these legal issues and the challenges that they bring to us, don't leave the ecosystem behind. Let's not make that be our legacy. Let's be proud at the next Olympics and the Olympics after that everybody collectively got this job done and America's competitiveness is there for everybody to see. Thank you all very much.